The following program is to provide entertainment and information. It is not considered to be any legal or investment advice. Good morning, appraisers. Let's talk some real estate. You're listening to the Voice of Appraisal, the #1 appraisal podcast in America that always brings you the latest news and information from the front lines of the real estate market. Anything from market conditions, appraisal regulations, cryptocurrencies, big bank news. Folks, you have a question, we have all of your answers. We are the one-stop source for all of your real estate appraisal information needs. If you want to be in the know, you have definitely tuned in to the right show. I'm your host, Phil Crawford. Happy to have all of you here with us today. Kevin, how you doing, bud?
I'm doing good. I got a quick question for you there, Phil.
Yes.
How does it feel to be in Captain Kirk's captain's chair again?
Finally back down here at the studios of 1480 WDJO. We're down here at the studios because we don't want this interview to have any technical glitches. We have a very special guest on the show today. We have Danielle DiMartino Booth. She is the best-selling author of Fed Up, an insider's take on why the Federal Reserve is bad for America. Danielle has been on countless radio appearances, on television. She's on Bloomberg. She's on Neil Cavuto's Fox News all the time. And she just did a wonderful article about mortgage refinancing by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. This article came out in Bloomberg. It's basically titled, Mortgage Refinancing Boom is Too Automated. Too automated, something we've been talking about for a long time. There's too many appraisal waivers going on over at the GSEs, and that's what we're going to talk about with Danielle DiMartino Booth and a whole lot of other things, too. So I don't want to waste any more time. Let's get into our interview with Danielle DiMartino Booth. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a very special guest on the Voice of Appraisal podcast today. We have Danielle DiMartino Booth. I'm a big fan of hers. Anytime I see her on any YouTube channels or any specials like that, I always tune in to find out what she's talking about and get her insights. Danielle, how are you today? Thank you very much for being on the Voice of Appraisal podcast.
I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Well, I'm happy you're here. Will you please just do a brief overview as to who you are, your history in the finance world with the Federal Reserve for our audience?
I'll be as brief as I can. I came out of business school. I went to the bright lights in the big city of New York, Wall Street, started out at an investment bank. It was called DLJ at the time. We were bought out by Credit Suisse. Credit Suisse was one of the very first firms to market a collateralized mortgage obligation. Mm-hmm. I didn't see who would be buying the equity tranche back then in 2001. Clearly something happened along the way called 9/11, actually, as it pertains to me. I'd gotten my second master's in journalism from Columbia at night while I worked full-time on Wall Street. Okay. So I ended up signing a non-compete, following my heart back to Dallas. I wrote about the coming housing crisis and put myself on the map. I became public enemy #1 of the real estate and banking community, and ended up, subsequent to that, being asked to come serve at the Federal Reserve, which I did for almost 9 years as an advisor to Richard Fisher throughout the crisis. And I came out and pretty much do what I used to do. I follow every aspect of the financial markets, including residential real estate, which is kind of deepest in my wheelhouse, if you will, at a company called Quill Intelligence.
That's right.
So we publish daily and we publish weekly.
So you have this huge history with the Federal Reserve. You kind of know what's going on behind the scenes when it comes to the Fed. And just recently, you put out this wonderful article on Bloomberg entitled Mortgage Refinance Boom is Too Automated, where you discuss your conversation with Ed Pinto. Ed used to be with Fannie Mae, and he is claiming that there are appraisal waivers going on at Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac in the cash-out refinance world. Your thoughts on this?
Well, there aren't some of them. There are a ton of them. So, just in the 6 months ended September, and this was an accelerating trend, and I think that that's what you have to keep in mind, that this is not something that is static in nature. Remember, when we got to cash-out refinancing's peak, it was $700 billion at an annual run rate, and at this juncture, people have built up a lot more equity in their homes. And back during the subprime heyday, it was income verification that had been automated by Fannie and Freddie, which caused its own set of issues in the aftermath. But today, the aspect of refinancing is appraisals.
Right.
And the automated appraisal waivers are increasingly part of what Fannie and Freddie are using. If Ed's explained things to me correctly, right now Fannie and Freddie have an 80% market share of your plain vanilla refinancings where there's no cash out involved, and they've got a 90% market share of the cash-out refinancings that, again, $100 billion in the 6 months through September, but it was in an accelerating pace. I can't see why we wouldn't be at $33 to $40 billion run rate at this juncture when you and I are speaking, possibly moving up to $50 billion a month, given the rapidity with which home prices are accelerating, which is, in many people's view, much too quickly, because we're pushing into the 15% year-over-year realm right now, which, by the way, Canada's pushing 20%. So it's just craziness everywhere with these central bankers gone wild, and that's effectively what's happening with Jay Powell trying to buy up more than what originators are even producing on a net basis.
Okay, so you make some very good points here. I want to go over a couple of things here. Number one, the values are flying up throughout most of the country, and you know as well as I do. For the first time in history, the 10-year Treasury note went below 1% on March 5th of this year because of the whole COVID lockdown situation, which really drove mortgage interest rates down. But I will tell you, on this show, we have talked time and time again about the dangers of these appraisal waivers. I'm going to tell you a little secret. Now, don't tell anybody, but Fannie and Freddie didn't used to call them appraisal waivers. They called them PIWs. They were considered to be property inspection waivers, and the appraisal community got mad about it, and they had to change the title over to appraisal waivers. Now, on this show, we considered PIWs, property inspection waivers, not to be PIWs, but risk assessment pissing in the wind. That's what we used to call it because it was ridiculous to be doing these type of appraisal waivers. So we saw that taking place, Danielle. We know that it's taking place with traditional refinances. We have heard through the grapevine that's taking place with cash out refinances. And I'll tell you something else. What really concerns me as a real estate appraiser is Fannie and Freddie. Are you ready for it? They're doing property inspection waivers on purchase transactions, which I think is detrimental to consumer issues. Your thoughts on it? That
is problematic on a whole different level.
Did you know that? First of all, did you know that they're doing property inspection waivers, appraisal waivers on purchase transactions? Did you know that?
This is the first I'm hearing of it. It doesn't surprise me because there's inherent danger in once you automate something,
yes,
especially if what you're doing is politically popular. And we have to bear in mind, these are political entities.
About 2 years ago, I had Sharon Whitaker from the ABA on, and we talked about the appraisal waivers. We talked about the fact the consumer needs to understand that when an appraisal is done, when they purchase a home, the consumer should not rely on that appraisal to make a decision about buying a house. Okay, right now, there's no disclosure out there just telling consumers, hey, listen, when you buy a house and you have an appraisal done, that appraisal is not being done for you. You get your own appraisal. That's just done for the bank's risk assessment. Now, over time, because the consumers always had the opportunity to review the appraisal, they may have used it as a tool to make a decision if they want to buy the house. Now, when you have appraisal waivers out there and you're waiving appraisals on purchase transactions, especially in some of these markets that are extremely undersupplied and there's multiple offers, let me tell you, you have a big, big problem brewing right now, especially when it comes to consumer issues, consumer advocacy issues, and with the data sets themselves. I have been an appraiser for 20 years. I love my data sets. And I'm telling you right now, Danielle, what ends up happening is when you have too many of these transactions that have waivers done at the purchase, what does that purchase become in the next month? It becomes a comparable, okay? Once it becomes a comparable, then it will be used in other appraisals to compare and to appraise other properties. So therefore, by not having the appraisals done at time of purchase, you could be destroying the data set and driving values up. Danielle, your thoughts on all of that?
It truly made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It's more than an accident waiting to happen.
Yes.
Because not only do the comparables feed into the home resale market, they also feed into the cash-out refinancing engine, if
Bingo.
you will. They continue to build upon one another, and that is highly problematic. There was something that Ed Pinto said about FHA lending, and a friend of mine in New Jersey just sold his parents' home, and he was surprised that there were all these offers, and the couple who came in and bought the house using an FHA loan ended up buying the house for 6% over where it had been listed, with a 3.5% down payment. So I'm not saying that FHA lending itself is any more lax than it's been traditionally, but they're basing it off of the word that you use, which is key, which is comparable.
That's right. That's right.
And comparables, they're put into MSA systems. They're entered into databases forever. Amen. And if that's going to be feeding into also first-time buyer activity, we're going to have a phenomenon that Ed Pinto described to me, which is it's an accounting terminology from back in undergraduate school, last in, first out.
That's right. That's exactly right. And here's the thing about it, Danielle. They don't have the knowledge. See, that's the big issue. That's where the consumer protection issue comes in. They're not being given the knowledge of what's going on. The waiver is being done, but you should have your own appraisal done to make sure that you're making a wise decision or the correct decision for you. There's nothing wrong with somebody going out there and paying 6% more for a property if it's in multiple offers. There's nothing wrong with it. But they have to be told and they have to have the knowledge that they need to get their own appraisal, and this is what's going on. That is not out there right now in the marketplace. Consumers are unaware of these activities. The National Association of Realtors jumps up and down and goes crazy and says, yay, terrific, we got an appraisal waiver. We can close early. The problem is that maybe this is not the best financial position for these home buyers. This has been going on now for literally a year and a half. We have discussed it on the show time and time again. If I'm a banker, someone walks in and they want to borrow 10% LTV or 25% LTV on their home, and they want to waive an appraisal or they want to do a desktop, that's fine. But when you get into some of this Fannie and Freddie, and like you brought up, FHA, where you're talking about 3.5% down, some of the Fannie and Freddie is 10% down, a very small correction in the market puts a substantial amount of people in an underwater position very, very quickly. And what gets me the most upset is the fact that the data set is messed up because of it.
And that's exactly right. And that's why people are going to think that the bottom has fallen out from underneath them.
Yes.
If you look at the data through the end of August, there are certain extremely large metropolitan statistical areas with FHA delinquency levels, the likes of which we've never, ever seen. 14.4% was where FHA delinquencies capped out in 2010.
Yes.
That was the darkest of the dark days. FHA delinquencies at 14.4%. Nationwide, as of the end of August, they were 17.4%.
Yes. Yes.
But if you look at some of the biggest metropolitan areas, Atlanta, they're 21.2%. Houston, they're 22.2%. Chicago, they're 22.2%. Dallas, where I am, they're 19.2%. These are massive. Washington, D.C. is 22%.
And what are the GSEs at? The GSEs are about at 8%, aren't they? Isn't Fannie and Freddie somewhere estimated to be about 8% as far as delinquency is concerned?
And then private market lenders are in between the two.
So you have Fannie and Freddie. You have the two GSEs. Why would they do this? Why would they do this? Is this all Jay Powell? Is this all the Federal Reserve? Is this all the money gun that he's got, that he just prints it all out? Is this the reason why this is taking place?
Well, some of it is Jay Powell, but the other aspect of it is that you've got an administration that is dead set on seeing these entities become private once again.
Yes.
And there are many beneficiaries if this was to come to pass. I'm putting on my old Wall Street hat right now.
Mm-hmm.
But the fact of the matter is the direction that they're going in dictates to me that the privatization is not even going to be an option because they're going to have to fall back on the taxpayer again.
Bingo.
Jay Powell's only part of the equation. Jay Powell is the means by which interest rates, the 30-year conventional, crashed south of 3%. That's Jay Powell buying, he owns a third of mortgage-backed securities. He's buying more net issuance than what the mortgage community is cranking out, and that is running at a record level. Mm-hmm. So when I try to describe to people, they're like, oh, Danielle, this is not another housing bubble. I'm like, no, this is not another housing bubble. This is not nearly as ubiquitous as it was years ago, but it is going to be a huge housing problem because of the amount of activity being done at runaway house prices in a time compression chamber facilitated by federal entities.
That's
so
exactly
you've
right.
only got a certain percentage of the workforce that says, you know what, I'm going to leave my penthouse in Manhattan and I'm going to go buy a mansion in the Hamptons, or somebody who's got a beautiful home, a big brownstone in San Francisco, and they're going to go buy a second home in Aspen just to have a little bit more room to stretch out when they're working from home. They have the money to do what they're doing. I'm not worried about them. Mm-hmm. I'm worried about the first-time home buyer that's getting sucked in. If you query millennials who have recently bought homes, it's as if they've been hit with a brick when it comes to maintaining these homes. Mm-hmm. Forget appraisals. These homes aren't being inspected. People are walking into situations that fiscally they don't understand, but they'll be pissed off for another 6 years while they have to work their credit back to being acceptable again. And we wonder why we have social division in America.
Okay, so you're bringing up some very good points here, because the one thing that we always say on the Voice of Appraisal podcast is the position of most appraisers. It's not the position of real estate agents, but appraisers. Home ownership is not the American dream. The American dream is your inalienable right given to you by God, guaranteed by the Constitution, to own property. Home ownership is a financial position. If you want to take it on or not, that's up to you. But when you look at home ownership today, like you said, you've got millennials jumping in at the height of the market. There is a huge demographic shift, so you have to consider that. But then you have the maintenance, you have the taxes, you have all these other things that come along with home ownership. You're right. It's a financial position that I don't think they're ready to take. And the one thing that cannot happen in any of these transactions is the appraisal to be waived during the purchase process. It is so important, and it is taking place right now, and we've been against it for a very, very long time. So, Danielle, let me ask you another question here. Let's talk about jobs, because you talk about first-time home buyers. They get into these financial positions. We have to make sure that their income is there. This recovery, the recovery from the coronavirus episode, is it a V-shaped recovery? Is it a K? Is it a W? Your thoughts on this?
Well, I think that it is something that is beyond just a simple K, because you definitely have the have. But by the same token, you have white-collar layoffs that are increasing in kind of a steady drumbeat of them. Every time you see a company that's going to be reducing headcount at their headquarters, or you see the word salaried employees, that is pushing up into the top of the K.
Right.
As far as the bottom of the K, the have-nots, so to speak, goes, that's turning into an L. And if you look at what the GDP estimate is for the fourth quarter, GDP for the third quarter, we're expecting to see bounce back by about what it went down. Went down about 30%. Turn off the lights, turn the lights back on, you get back about 30%. But without further stimulus spending into the fourth quarter, we're anticipating that the fourth quarter turns slightly negative again. In other words, we're back in recession after having been out for only one quarter. You talk about what Congress will have to do in order to prevent us from staying in recession, then you start to bring housing back into the discussion.
So, Danielle, you bring up the fact of stimulus, and I'm glad you went in that direction, because if I take a look at some of these recent articles here, I've got one out of MarketWatch.com where it talks about the headline, "I'm terrified." These are people that are waiting around looking for their next $1,200 check. Here's another article out of Zero Hedge. 1 in 5 Americans could be, quote unquote, out of money by Election Day. We're getting to a position where the bottom of that K, which is now becoming that L, is getting pretty desperate. People are needing to have stimulus. Where do you see this going? This is getting dangerous.
It is getting dangerous, and the stakes are especially high because nobody talks about the elephant in the room. The fact that we've got 12 months of forbearance that doesn't end until the end of March.
Yes.
So every household's biggest line item is housing. And healthcare somewhere in that general arena. And we know that healthcare inflation itself is also off the rails, and that a lot of Americans who've lost their jobs don't have access to healthcare, meaning if their kid gets strep throat, they're paying top dollar to take them to a local clinic.
That's exactly right.
So we're in a very precarious position because we've had a decade of extremely low interest rates. We've had more than a decade looking into the rearview mirror where we could have been doing stimulus spending, where we could have been reskilling much of our workforce. We've had millions of Americans on the sideline for a generation, and yet somehow, some way, we've managed to not do anything about them. We've not done anything about our education system, and now we have a crisis staring at us such that Nancy Pelosi's $2+ trillion stimulus plan entailed another 12 months of forbearance, and another moratorium on foreclosure, and another moratorium on rental evictions. I have to bring up the fact that if I'm one of the 48% of U.S. landlords who are small business owners, what position exactly does that leave me in that I'm not allowed to throw somebody out of the apartment that they're living in, and I don't have income myself?
That's right.
So it's a mess right now. And to bring back the last part of our discussion, bless them. These FHA first-time homebuyers have no idea that they're buying into a housing market that would otherwise, if not for forbearance, see falling home prices.
And do you think it's a good time to have any appraisal waivers, given all this macroeconomic issues that are going on in the country? No. No, it's insane.
You couldn't imagine possibly a worse time for Fannie and Freddie to be trying to flame a housing bubble. It's just, somebody needs to try and douse them with water.
We're trying.
This is going to hurt the people who, every time the Fed comes out on the wires and they're like, we've really got to make sure that we're making policy for everybody. I'm like, well, then why don't you try and stop making people who are barely getting by, why don't you stop trying to throw them into the poorhouse by getting them into a home they can't afford at all-time high prices?
I know. And sometimes what really upsets me is the fact you brought it up, that Fannie and Freddie going down this path. FHFA's Mark Calabria, I like him. I saw him give a presentation at American Enterprise last year in Washington, D.C. He has good intentions. He wants to take both of the GSEs, take them to a private position. But I don't see how this can happen at all, especially with everything that's going on and the hubrisness behind the two entities. When all of this money is backing them up, the taxpayer money is just beyond me. As real estate appraisers, we're telling people right now, if you're a member of the public, when you're out there and you're buying a house, you make sure that you get your own appraisal done before you buy it so you know your accurate position. And also just ask an appraiser, what's the market conditions right now? Danielle, you bring up a perfect point. If you have all of these foreclosures that are on hold, you have all of these forbearances, and then you go into a market and you see that there's this tremendous undersupply, well, I wonder why. No one's moving because no one's getting evicted or kicked out or foreclosed. I hate to say that, but that's how markets work, Danielle.
Well, it is how markets work, but there's also a massive demographic factor at work. The census released data recently that showed that 52% of the people between, I think it was 18 and 29 years old, are back to living with their parents. So you don't have baby boomers selling as they would otherwise. And there's still a fear of the virus and having an open house. It's also kept supply at artificially low levels. So that only compounds the situation. And there's one silver lining to all of this, and that is that if the stock market is to finally come off its all-time highs, and if that is going to really scare baby boomers into throwing their homes on the market to try and monetize the home equity that they've built up, they might not go that route if there's more than one generation living under the same roof.
It's a very good point.
And that might be a saving grace, but by the same token, you're certainly not going to have the type of regenerative economic growth that you would have emanating from the millennial generation becoming the largest generation in America if they've only got 4.6% of the stock holdings of all the other generations. And that's what people don't understand. It's that millennials have very little in the way of wealth. So people are always like, well, there's just going to be this generational handoff between the boomers to the millennials. That's not true. The millennials don't have the money, and they've been disproportionately affected by the layoffs in the current crisis. And sadly enough, a lot of them are overeducated and will be underpaid for the rest of their lives.
Okay, so that's a terrific point, because my children are not millennials. My children fall into that Z category. They're Generation Z. Now, I look at them, and I look at the numbers of millennials, and I look at the number of Z kids, and I say to myself, and I say to my kids, there is going to be a lot of opportunity, because you are walking into big, powerful generations here. Now, they're not going to have a lot of wealth, but I don't know if you've called a plumber recently or called an electrician recently, but we do have this massive lack of skilled workers in the country. And I do see a lot of possibilities in that generation for that skilled labor. But that goes back to what you were saying about wasting our money and not educating our children properly.
That's exactly right. Part of my heritage is German. Most of it is passionate Italian. But the part of me that's German has great respect for the fact that the German youth unemployment rate is the lowest in the developed world, and that is because starting in 2005, 2007, they took on major initiatives to pump up their vocational training and pump up their skills training such that they wouldn't have the situation that you see in Italy and in France and, by the way, increasingly in the United States. But in the United States, it's not going to be a youth unemployment as it's going to be much the generation that's behind them, the millennials. And that is a generation that I'm concerned could actually become an economic drag, but they're going to have the ability in numbers to continue to vote in socialist type of legislation because they feel like they're the generation that's been left behind. And it's not just Generation Z, and I've got an intern who's Generation Z, total rock star, totally hardworking, never gave me, I need to take a Facebook break or I need a 3-week vacation. None of that. But there has to be something that is done for reskilling the millennial generation, maybe they've got a liberal arts degree and they're sitting on student debt they may never be able to pay off.
Right.
But we're still going to have to figure out how to reskill millions of Americans, because we can't face the prospect of a tomorrow in which there are all of these people who are basically not contributing anything to the U.S. economy and economic growth, because then we will end up voting in some form of socialism, and then I'll have to leave the country.
And the other thing is now we've already tried MMT. We've already tried universal basic income under this coronavirus issue. We're probably going to get some more universal basic income coming up soon. Get ready, because on the appraisal side, I'm already ahead of the game. If you have UBI, Danielle, then guess what? On the appraisal side, there's going to be a movement for UBV, universal basic valuation techniques. It's coming in those directions. We see it all, and I'm telling you something, it's absolutely amazing. I'm glad I was able to surprise you today over the information about the appraisal waivers going on over at the GSEs when it comes to purchases. We've been screaming about it for a long time, and there really has been no movement on it. Final thoughts really quick. Do you foresee or do you see interest rates ever going up under Jay Powell and the Federal Reserve?
Well, Jay Powell's term ends in February of 2022, so I'm not so sure that the deflationary effect of having so many millions of Americans unemployed and underemployed is not going to be the stronger inflation, if you will. But if the market starts to sniff out the fact that the Fed, whether it's Jay Powell or his successor, if the market starts to sniff out the Fed's willingness to be a true accomplice and print whatever it is that Congress passes via legislation, if the market thinks that we're going from $27 trillion of debt to $60 trillion of debt, then the inflation that the Federal Reserve keeps worrying that it can't locate, boy, I need that 2% inflation target, they're going to get it, and the market will take over the process of setting interest rates. And that is something that we haven't seen since the 80s, and that very few American homeowners today can recall mortgage rates rising, much less mortgage rates rising at a very fast pace. So it's entirely within the realm of possibilities because of the fiscal path that we are on, not necessarily the monetary path. The monetary is the means by which the fiscal is monetized. All the debt that's being created is monetized. So the two have to go hand in hand.
If market rates do come into play and the market starts to dictate what interest rates will be, then I have a sneaky feeling that housing prices and asset prices will decline based upon that, because what is a 30-year mortgage at today? 2.75, 3% as of today. That's basically unheard of, but yet that is the norm. What if these interest rates go up to 5, 6, 7% under normalization? The asset prices of the homes drops substantially. It could be a huge shock on the entire system. And it's not a time, in my personal opinion, to be doing any kind of appraisal waiver whatsoever. It's a time to be serious about risk assessment and make sure that your valuations are accurate. Would you, knowing how Wall Street works and how all of this comes together, would you ever buy a mortgage-backed security that was originated with 2020 paper right now, Danielle?
That's a really good question. And I do happen to have my mother in a Ginnie Mae fund, and that's where she keeps her cash. But on the other hand, Ginnie Mae has the explicit backing of the government, which does indeed give her a nice pickup in yield.
Well, there you go. Listen, you are welcome to come on the show anytime you want. I really appreciate you taking the time today to discuss this with me. This is a terrific article out of Bloomberg. Can you tell our listeners how they can get in touch with you, especially with your project with quills?
Please come to quillintelligence.com. We have a very reasonably priced daily that is entertaining and extremely informative with absolutely no bias, sell-side bias, buy-side bias, all that stuff. No. There's no agenda. It's just pure research. So please come to Quill Intelligence and follow me on Twitter. Some people call it better than an economics degree. So just following me is well worth your time as well.
I have one final question for you, Danielle, and this is extremely important. When I look at all of your YouTube appearances, I've been following you now for about a year and a half. Your monetary policy, I would consider to be very similar to the Lincoln Greenback years of the 1860s to 1864s. Would you agree with me on that statement?
I think that there is good reason in the United States of America today that the last name of Lincoln is looked back on as much as it is. It is with good and fair reason that he's the second most popular president in U.S. history, aside from our very first George Washington himself.
And yet you married a Booth. I'm just saying.
Well,
I'm just saying. I'm just. I just had to say it.
Actually, his first name is John, but his middle name is not Wilt.
Well, listen, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it. Have a good day, and keep in touch, okay?
Thank you. Likewise. Great talking to you today.
And there goes Danielle DiMartino Booth. Kevin, what do you think? I think we shocked her a little bit.
I think you got her with the question at the end there about John
Most. The irony. But no, it is. It's absolutely amazing, the fact that we have, for a very long time, on Voice of Appraisal, have been talking about the problems with the PIWs, with the pissing in the wind, with the what we used to call Sex Panther AVMs, remember? Because 90% of the time, they worked 10% of the time. We always had the issues with these products. And the biggest problem I ever had, and even Sharon Whitaker over at the American Bankers Association, she had the same issue. It has to come down with the appraisal waivers, the PIWs, on the purchase transactions. It just can't happen. It has to stop. The process has to stop. The natural process of having the appraisal done, a full appraisal or a desktop appraisal, the new, Fannie Mae desktop rules and regulations that are in place, that's fine. But that assessment has got to be performed. Otherwise, the data sets will be skewed. And I think that's it. I really do. I don't have any proof of this right now, Kevin. I don't have proof of it. But maybe, just maybe, we can get into markets and say to ourselves, hey, if the values are up 12% year over year because of what's happened this last year, if the values are up that much because interest rates have lowered so much, of that 12%, how much of that percentage is due to the fact that appraisal waivers are out there on purchases and driving values up without the third-party unbiased opinion on top of the risk assessment analysis? That's what I'm saying. That could be a real possibility, and that's something that we're going to be focused on more and more as time goes on. Boy, it's nice to be back down here in the radio station again, Kevin. The energy's back now.
Right.
I had to do the home thing, and we've done some things in the home, and that was fine. We'll still continue to do that. But I'm glad to be back down here in the station and making it happen, that's for sure.
Security let you in, so
they let me in. I got my mask on. I have my mask. I have my antibodies. I have my antibodies now. You can come over here and give me a hug and lick my forehead if you want to, Kevin. That's fine. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of our show for this week. And as always, I would like to thank you for listening. As we journey through the mysteries and complexities that are, in fact, the real estate appraisal business, we would like to thank our guest, Danielle DiMartino Booth, for being here, for her thoughtful insight and knowledge. God willing, we're going to be back here very soon reporting from the front lines of the real estate market. In the meantime, you kiss your spouse, you hug your children, enjoy your day. Be safe in the field. Be safe, safe, safe. You've been listening to Phil Crawford on Voice of Appraisal. We'll talk very soon.